and other community leaders to students in a bar setting, and that resulted with bar talks. The AMS is the official representative of all the undergraduate and graduate students at University of Vancouver. We offer 250 clubs, we operate the student union building, we brought you the U-Pass, we hold big events like Block Party, and so much more. So please check out our website, ams.ubc.ca, to get some more information. And I'd like to introduce Gordon Caddick, who will introduce the topic of bar talk.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. I just want to know, we've got a panel coming. We've got a panel discussion here, so if you're not here for bar talk, you're welcome to stay, but you've got to keep your volume to a minimum, please. So, just in time for the holidays, we've got a panel here on the future of the Christian church, and we've got a pretty amazing lineup. To my left, Professor Ara Nolan Zayan from the UBC Psychology Department His research interests are in evolutionary and cognitive approaches to religious thought and behavior, and issues of cultural variability and universality in human psychology. He just wrote a book called Big Gods, How Religion Transformed Cooperation and Conflict. And John Stackhurst, to his left, is a professor of theology and culture at Regent College, who draws on history, sociology, theology, and philosophy to explore the intersection of the Christian faith and contemporary culture. He's also an advising editor to Christianity Today and a contributor to the National Post. And to his left is Douglas Todd, a Vancouver-based journalist, speaker, and author who writes on spirituality, ethics, and diversity for the Vancouver Sun. He also has a popular blog called The Search. I highly recommend it because it talks about controversial topics like race, sex, and religion. Give a big round of applause for Carol.
Ready to go? Ready to go. Okay. I'm starting because I'll try and give a bit of an overview on what's going on with religion and immigration, actually, in BC and Cascadia, which is Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. This region is the least religious portion of the continent, and BC is by far the most exaggerated kind of for that in terms of polling. When people, I'll talk about Metro Vancouver because it's even more dramatic. It's 2.5 million people. 45% of them are born outside the country, so we're the third most hyper-diverse major city in the world in terms of having different ethnicities living alongside each other and immigrants living alongside of immigrants. And so that's changed the complexion here. But the other thing that's kind of startling about Metro Vancouver is 45% of the people tell the census takers that they have no religion. And that's unheard of in almost any part of the world. Including New York City, they would have a much higher rate of people saying they're religious. Who knows what they mean by that, but we are a very unusual place. And just to go over a few of the facts and figures, this largest religious group here is the Catholics. They're about 17% of the population. They would be struggling quite a lot in Metro Vancouver if it wasn't for immigration. High immigration, especially from the Philippines, and I don't know because they don't keep stats, but I guess almost a third of the active Catholics here are Filipinos. The next largest group is the Protestants, but they're about the same size, but they're divided into many camps, which is what Protestants are famous for. And the biggest divide might be the sort of old line Protestants or mainline Protestants and the evangelicals. And I will get to the charismatics in a second because we've been asked to speak about that. Sikhs are in a way, they're the second biggest actual religion after Christianity. There's 8% Sikhs in Metro Vancouver, about 5% Buddhists, 4% Muslims, 1% Jews. Hindus are about 3%. So as a religion writer, this is a very exciting place to cover diversity. About 16% of atheists here. So 45% say they're not religious, but only 16% say they're actual atheists. So I think we've got more people in Metro Vancouver and BC and Cascadia who would say they're spiritual but not religious. You've heard it probably a million times now. It is a very valuable kind of category. And it's for people who just don't want to be associated with an institution, but they have all sorts of spiritual beliefs. They might believe in God or spiritual healing or all sorts of things. They just don't want to think they're religious. I know evangelicals say they're not religious, so it gets a little complicated. Let's see. I was just reading today, and it's really got me interested. A couple of days ago, there was a big sociologist of religion named Robert Bella who just died. And he says, okay, in terms of declining, the Protestant church is in serious decline in North America, especially here. And by that I mean mostly what they used to call mainline Protestants, United Church of Canada, Anglicans, Lutherans. They're struggling big time. And they tend to be liberal people. There's intolerance, diversity, accepting everybody. And Robert Bella, the sociologist, thinks that the Protestants, these Protestants, the liberal Protestants, are actually they sort of won at the same time that they've lost. Like their values have infiltrated the general culture. in terms of liberalism and acceptance and, having a spirituality but not being part of the church. I think there's something to that. I'm sure you have some thoughts on it. I could use some other examples, but we only get 4 minutes. So charismatic churches, I've been to some of them, and there's probably some charismatic groups on campus for that matter. I think you said there's 45 Christian groups on campus. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been to some of the charismatic churches here, the Pentecostal churches, where people tend to speak in tongues, believe in exorcism, they believe in spiritual healing, they tend to believe that Jesus is return to earth in an apocalypse is imminent. They're very powerful with religious right in the United States. They're not as powerful here. The actual denomination is called Pentecostal, but they come in. There's charismatic Catholics too. There's 500,000 Pentecostals in Canada, and there's 500 million in the world. They say a quarter of the world's Christians are Pentecostal, and I think there's very large churches opening up in the valley. They've been going for years actually, but now they're starting to form a bit more downtown Vancouver. It's called the West Side Church was one of them. They just bought the big Ford Theater downtown. It's very exciting, kind of an event to go to. Lots of singing and happiness and other things we can talk about later. That's my little intro.
The topic we're supposed to talk about this evening has to do with the future of Christianity in Canada, and Doug's very helpful in giving us a snapshot of the lay of the land. If we go back historically a little bit to widen out the frame of reference, Canada was largely not a church-going country in the early part of the 19th century. Most of the colonists who came to Canada didn't want to go to church. Even if there was a church that they could get to, they didn't go. And between about the 1840s and the 1860s, evangelists came up from the Methodist and the Baptist movements in the United States to evangelize English-speaking Canada, both in the Maritimes and in Ontario. And the Roman Catholics, as the 19th century went on, underwent a very powerful revival of piety there too. So that by the time of Confederation, most Canadians were actually enfolded in the Christian church. And as the decades rolled on, Canadians were largely dominated by Christian culture, whether the Roman Catholic version in Quebec or the Protestant version in English-speaking Canada. And that lasted for almost 100 years. There was really a kind of Christian century in Canada from about the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, where politicians would routinely refer to Christian principles, where Christian holy days were put as part of the national calendar and people had days off, where the Sundays were restricted in terms of commerce and recreation. And in many respects, Canadians were sincere Christians. One of the ways we try to measure sincerity sociologically and historically is a very easy measure, which is how many people actually care enough about their religion to get up on a Sunday morning and go to church. We don't really care so much what they say, but what do they actually do? And so church attendance, or more broadly, or synagogue or mosque attendance, as late as 1946, 2/3 of Canadians were going to church every weekend. 2/3. In 1946, in just a generation, maybe a generation and a half, that number, which was 2 in 3, has now dropped to 2 in 10 across the country. So if your parents or grandparents were living in Canada at the time, and they start talking about the old days, they're not just being nostalgic, it really was different. In fact, we Canadians have been racing the Dutch for the fastest secularization in modern history since the French Revolution, where a country has been seriously, church-goingly, publicly Christian, and we're trying to become unchristian almost as quickly as we can, literally within living memory. What it seems to me then, I don't know if I want to introduce in the conversation, when journalists ask me, when people like Doug Lestrade come along and say, well, I don't want you to just talk about the past, I want you to predict the future, which I love. I love that, because of course I don't have a degree in futurology. And it used to bother me when journalists would come to the end, I would be careful in my history, my sociology, what's going to happen next? And it used to bother me until I realized no one cared. I could say whatever I liked. No one would remember. Doug could come back next week. I could give him a different answer. Okay, only he would remember. So then I felt a certain liberty, and I would say things like, well, if certain continuing trends will continue, ... And I'd say whatever I wanted after that. Because current trends never continue in a straight line forever. History's full of curves and of rewinds and of side trails. So to predict the future is a mud's game. But since we're here tonight, and I got another minute, I'll tell you this. One of the interesting questions that all three of us place at the very center of what we do professionally is to try to figure out, why is anybody religious at all? What function does religion play for people? I mean, if you've got enough food, and if you've got interesting things to do with your time, and you're living in a safe and comfortable place, why would you bother getting up on Sunday, especially in Vancouver, when there's so many cool things to do on Sunday? Why would you go to church? I ask myself that every couple of Sundays. Why would you go to church? And this is a very important question. And it seems to me that there are really only two answers. So now you should be on your guard as university people when somebody gives you just a simple answer like that. But go ahead and be on your guard. There are two reasons to be religious. One is that you can get something else that's good by way of religion. That is, religion can be instrumental. It might, for instance, be a way of bringing a bunch of people together in a cause, maybe nationalism. And so religion is a kind of flag that you fly to unite people around the cause of nationalism. Much of the 16th century can be explained by people becoming Protestant throughout Europe in order to be not Catholic and rebel against the empire. So religion sometimes can be a rallying point or a legitimation or some other way of getting something else you want. And frankly, when I was growing up, lots of people went to church so that they could meet business prospects, so they could meet possible marriage partners, so they could be able to enjoy a certain reputation in the community. Almost all of that's gone away. There's a couple places in Canada that's still true. Southern Manitoba, among some of the Mennonite communities, that might still be true. Certain parts of the Maritimes, you probably need to show up in church, but almost everywhere else in Canada now, using religion to get something else is just about gone. The other reason to be religious is because you want what religion is offering you. You really want to connect with God. You really want to connect with the spiritual. You really want a moral guide to your life. So what we've seen, it seems to me, in Canada is an evacuation of the first category. Almost nobody goes to church, synagogue, or mosque anymore, with the exception of ethnic groups who still practice religion as a way of forming ethnic solidarity. But once that's gone, people tend to only go to church because they find something churchy or religious there that's valuable to them. And that's almost always a minority of the population. The future of Christianity, in particular in Canada, is, to me, going to depend very largely on whether the next 40 or 50 years in Canada give Canadians a reason to seek God or not. And one of the main reasons why the statistics are the way they are, as Doug suggested, is that in Vancouver, most people don't feel they need God, thank you very much. I'm doing actually just fine by myself. And I sit and watch the rollerbladers in the summer wheeling around Yale Town, and they're all more fit and more beautiful than I ever was, let alone how I am now. And I think they don't need religion. They're grooving on things right now. But where people are dislocated, where people have had their worlds changed or shattered, then you generally find religious interest. That hasn't happened in Canada for quite a while. We've actually gone a long time without a depression or a major war or some other reason why people's worlds have been shattered. If that happens, we'll see a return to religion. If we don't, I think that the number is going to stay the way they are or even decline.
John? All right.
So I'm a social psychologist, and I came to study religion in a bit of an odd way, because in my field of psychology, for a long time, religion was not even in the picture. You could open a psychology textbook. I don't know if you've ever taken intro-psych or even more advanced psychology courses. If you look up the index, you won't find the word religion. And when I was a graduate student and was doing my PhD in psychology, I was just a recent immigrant from Lebanon, where I grew up from Beirut. I grew up in Beirut during the religious wars of the 70s and 80s. So religion was on my mind. Religion was everywhere. People were killing each other for religion. People were were just so passionate about religion. So I thought, of course, psychologists know a lot about religion. So I was, imagine my shock when I found out that actually psychologists didn't care or know much about religion. So I decided to study it, and as I started to look into the history of how psychologists thought about religion, I realized that actually the founders of psychology, people like William James and Sigmund Freud, Gordon Allport, were actually extremely interested in religion. So something odd happened in the 20th century when the field dropped this topic. Now things have changed dramatically. In the last 10, 15 years, the topic of religion has come back with a vengeance, and now there is a lot of interest in religion. The way that I study religion, I come from the perspective of psychology, so I'm interested in understanding what is it about human brains that make us interested or open or inclined towards religious beliefs and practices. What is it that, when people think about God or have a relationship with God, what are they doing? What are they thinking? What increases this motivation? What decreases this motivation? How is practice connected to belief, etc.? So that's one important element of what I do. But I'm also very interested in understanding the origins of religion. So why do we have religion? As John was talking about, what are the reasons why religion exists in the world? After all, every society we know of in the world has religion. Historically, when we look back, we don't find any evidence of any society that didn't have religion. So it seems like religion has been a universal feature of human brains and human cultures. At the same time, we do see evidence of, at least recently, people distancing themselves from religion, which is also interesting and important and need to study. So that's how I'm coming, from my perspective, coming to this topic. Now, I just want to, in the remainder of the time I have, I just want to say a little bit about global trends in religion, which I think are also important, because when we talk about Christianity in Canada, we should keep in mind what's going on in the globe overall. And I'm sure that Doug and John also can add more to this. But the question that many of you might be wondering about is, how is religion doing in the world as a whole? Are there more religious people now than before, or less religious people than before? And the answer is, well, there are two answers, and they're both true. Answer number one is, religion is doing great. Thank you very much. Most people in the world are very religious, deeply religious. We don't realize this in Vancouver, because Doug said we are in a bubble here, but most of the world is deeply religious. The answer number two, however, is that religion is in deep trouble. How could this both be true? The answer, of course, is geography. It all depends on where you look. If you look at Western and Northern Europe, you see basically a post-Christian society. Religion has declined so much that people are now talking about post-Christian culture. United States is an odd society. The United States should be much less religious than it is, given what we know about what predicts religiosity. That's a different topic we can talk about. Canada is an intermediate case where Canada is where Europe used to be maybe 30 years ago. So the trends that I've seen across decades look like religion is declining in Canada, as John said. And if nothing dramatic happens, probably this trend will continue and there will be quite a decline. Now, how could this both be true, and how would that explain the fact that religion overall has stayed stable in the world? So there are two things to consider. There are two major forces, I think, that are pushing against each other in the world that can help us understand the future of religion. One is secularization. So when societies become more wealthy, when there is what's called existential security, that means people feel secure and safe in their lives, lifespans are long, infant mortality is very low, there's access to social safety nets, so there's universal health care. If you lose your job, there's insurance, so you can get insurance payments. If you live in this kind of a stable world, you don't have that much inclination to want to be religious. You don't want to get up on Sunday morning and go to church. Conversely, if there's existential insecurity, then you have much more religiosity. So as the world is becoming more wealthy, more economically and politically stable, that is leading to the decline of religion. But that doesn't mean that the world is becoming less religious, because there's a counter trend that often we miss and we don't realize, and which is the fact of demography, which is the fact of fertility rates. Religious people by far have many more children than secular people. And within religions, more fundamental strains of religions, of any religion I know, have more children than the more liberal denominations. Which means basically that whatever religion is losing from secularization is gaining from fertility rates. What's even worse for secular societies is that I don't know of any secular societies that are actually producing children at replacement levels. The most atheistic societies in the world are actually shrinking. So that's an important, very powerful trend to also consider when we try to understand what's happening in religion, and it also has implications in Canada as well.
Thanks. So thanks for the good background there. We're going to open up the floor for Q&A, so just raise your hand, and the guy with the red hair is going to run over and give you a mic. Try to keep your questions short, or I will cut you off. So, yeah. Any questions? Maybe I'll open the floor to a question to Doug. You spoke about how Cascadia is particularly spiritual. What exactly does that mean, and what do you think accounts for it?
Yes, Cascadia, Washington, Oregon, BC, have a lot of similarities, but also on a spiritual level. And it is this, I think, this secular but, well, actually, one phrase is secular but spiritual, or spiritual but not religious. And it is a pretty amorphous thing. It can, like, there's probably 100 definitions of spiritual. If there's like 100 definitions of love, there's probably 100. If you ever have a discussion about spiritual, you have to agree on the definition first, or it's kind of going to be a useless discussion. So some people will believe in God, but some people might be just into meditation and not believe in God and say they're spiritual, and that's probably valid. I actually think atheists can be spiritual. It's about how you create meaning for yourself. But I think it's a real reaction to being a member of a group. British Columbians and Cascadians just don't like groups very much. They like to do their own thing. We're a very individualistic culture, and it's just one of the many reasons that organized religion has a battle here. Is there anything else you want me to say about the word spiritual? It's, I don't know where you guys are at, but sometimes it can be kind of annoying to hear somebody say, a little smugly, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And it's sort of an easy answer. So I'm going around saying that religion is actually superior to spirituality these days, because I think religion can include spirituality, just to stir something up.
But it seems to me that the crucial difference that most Canadians, I think, mean when they say that is, when they say religion, they mean a proper noun religion with definitive texts, a Bible, a Quran, something else, a definitive clergy, and it's going to tell me what to do. And I'm going to be judged if I'm not a good member of that. You can be a bad Christian, and that makes sense, right? You can be a lousy Muslim, that actually makes sense. You can't really be lousy at spirituality because you define it any way you want. Like, don't you look at that beautiful sunset over English Bay? Doesn't that give you a warm feeling? Yeah, it totally does. Okay, it's spiritual. But so that's the great thing, and no wonder it's so popular in Cascadia, because this is the culture where we all want to stop listening to somebody telling us what to do.
So I'm very interested in this demographic phenomenon that we really don't understand very well because it's so recent and it's not very well studied. But I'll say a couple of things that are on my mind right now. One thing is that even in society that are majority atheist, majority non-religious, like say a place like Denmark or the Netherlands, where 75%, 50 to 75% people say, I'm not religious, I don't believe in God. When you ask about spiritual beliefs, you get very high numbers. So a lot of people who don't believe in God, who say, I'm not religious, they believe in things that we would consider spiritual. Mystical forces, telepathy, astrology, etc., etc. So there are lots of interesting things that, but usually we call these paranormal beliefs, that are beliefs that are not necessarily supported by scientific evidence, but they're not strictly speaking religious beliefs, they're paranormal beliefs. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Just because societies are not, or individuals are not religious, they can still have spiritual beliefs, and we need to understand more what that means.
Yeah, you talked about how religion's on the decline because of economic well-being and political stability, and whereas like if things go the other way and people aren't doing so good, they turn to religion. So, but I've read a lot of different articles and stuff about this. But from like a psychologist perspective, what's your explanation that people turn to religion instead of like more practical?
Yeah, so there I can very quickly I can give you 2 lines of evidence for that. So one line of evidence is you look at culture and historical trends. So one recent example is a very cool study that was done in New Zealand, where the researchers were basically, they were measuring religiosity levels over time, and then the earthquake happened, the Christchurch earthquake. It was a massive earthquake. It was devastating. And then they kept measuring religiosity, and they were able to see what happens to religiosity after an earthquake. And what they found was religiosity increased in New Zealand after an earthquake, but only in the regions that were directly affected by the earthquake. In fact, in the regions that were not directly affected by the earthquake, there was secularization. People became over time less religious, whereas in the Christchurch area, people became more religious. And there are lots of evidence like that. If you look at places where they're more vulnerable to earthquakes or hurricanes, etc., these are natural disasters, or more political instability, economic instability, you see more religion. The other kind of evidence that also shows this is experimental. So I've done some research where we actually, for example, bring participants into our lab, and then we, for some of them, we remind them of their death. Another way you can do it, that other people have done, you can remind people of, or we can induce feelings of not having control in your life, feelings of personal instability, and when you do that, people become more religious temporarily.
How do you do that?
Oh, that's easy. So the way that we remind people of death, you can do it back down because you forget about the fact that you thought about death. But imagine in places where people are chronically facing death, then religion becomes much more of a compelling idea compared to people where probability, threat to your own integrity will make people seek religion.
Well, exactly, because religion, after all, is a map of the world. Every religion gives you a map of the world. So this is the way the world is, despite what you think it is. This is the way the world actually is. And this is the way to cope with the world properly. And if you're coping with the world just fine, you don't need a Hindu guru, you don't need the Dalai Lama, you don't need Billy Graham. If you're coping with the world fine, you don't need religion. It's only when your world is no longer under control that you seek help. And from a Christian point of view, this is exactly what we would expect to see. But it's the sociology and the psychology backs up exactly what Christian faith would say, namely that people don't inherently seek God. That people actually inherently seek their own good and their own pleasure according to their own lights. Blaise Pascal was very clear about this. We spend actually a lot of money protecting ourselves against the idea of our own death, insulating ourselves and distracting ourselves against the idea that we need any help from above or that we are accountable to anything beyond ourselves. It's only when those coping mechanisms give way that people then look around for something better. And that's a rational response. There's no reason to be religious unless there's a reason to be religious. And what we're suggesting is that either religion gets you something else you want, like a mate or a social advantage of some kind, or it connects you with a God and a way of life that's better than the one you have now. Otherwise, there's no reason to be religious. And Canadians are living in a pretty nice time in our history where most of us are kind of doing okay. You know where I see most young, the demographic that I think shows the most interest in lively religion, the kind of religion we're talking about, the church that's going downtown is a Mennonite church actually, rather than Pentecostal, but is 18 to 32-year-olds. Because it's the 18 to 32-year-olds now in Canada who are feeling most under threat. It's you guys who don't have a guarantee of a job, who don't have a guarantee of a mate, who don't have a guarantee that life is going to be better than your parents. No wonder you guys are looking at church much more seriously than your parents actually are, because you've got good reason to. Sorry about that, but I'm just speaking, social scientifically. Don't want anybody to order any more drinking than they really have to.
Just flip it over a little bit. I mean, some people, religious people, actually say the real religion of today is the economy, is the accumulation of wealth and power and prestige. And I think there's actually quite a bit to it. When you don't have sort of these transcendent beliefs, it's very easy just to pursue those things. I mean, we have people talking about serving the economy. Like, what? How about each other or whatever?
So I actually wanted to pick up on that theme as well and say that it seems to me the naturalization of religion that Professor Nureziana provides in his work is one that I find especially appealing, that we turn to religion because we seek communality and connection and bonding with other people. And I think that that's something that we're lacking here in North America, a common narrative. Even if it's like poetry or some sort of literature that we can all agree is interesting and that we can all talk about regularly, not just like for the week that Game of Thrones is on TV. So I guess what I want to know is to what extent do you see that in the fundamentalism of certain religions where they actually are becoming less and less poetic about their interpretation, and also in the I am spiritual but not religious response, which I always hear is sort of the Zoolander, I respect Sting, I don't know his music but I respect him, like, it's like I'm incredibly spiritual somehow but we don't know why.
He was great.
Club is for, and that's fine, that's a good thing, but why do you put a cross on it? Like, where does the value add itself in unquestionable terms of power and demonstrable authority, and that's where the exciting signs of Pentecostalism show up. That's why it's spreading so much in sub-Saharan Africa, why it's spreading so much in Korea and Latin America, because there indisputably is power that we don't normally see. There indisputably is something beyond what we have right now, and we're all looking for that. Or it's where people are bored to death with the religion that they have. And they're not so much in a crisis of dislocation as they have a spiritual hunger for something again that's going to finally grab them. I visited the Toronto Blessing 10 years ago or so, I guess it was now, and I was struck by how many otherwise perfectly ordinary, decent Canadians would love to come to this thing so that they could fall down. And I thought, you just spend enough time in a place like this, you'll fall down, and it's cheaper, I guess, at a church, but still, there's the sense of like, why am I doing it? Because I'm now connecting with something that is not boring, that is actually connecting me with a spiritual power beyond what I have. So that, again, in situations in Canada where there's stability and comfort and a certain sense in which I can manage my life very well, thank you, I don't think we're going to see Pentecostalism thrive here either. And it's, in fact, demographically, it's flattened out in Canada. As you know, within the last 10 years, it's flattened out. It's not gotten much. It's kind of holding its own, but partly for the reasons you suggested. Pentecostals and evangelicals generally not only tend to breed more children, they're also better at keeping them in their religious communities than other groups are. But still, that's only a relatively good thing in terms of, it's not a great record, it's just better than the others. But if we find here in BC that people explore these other spiritual alternatives and they keep drilling dry holes, then the ground's ready for the flash fire. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 years we see a revival of really exciting religion, probably Christianity, here in British Columbia, once the fires burn down sufficiently. And it's pretty much almost there now. It's about as low as you can go nowadays.
Question in the front here.
Okay, so I'm just wondering to all of you, I'm wondering, why do you think that spirituality has to be in the form of religion and has to be in the form of a sort of book and a sort of authority that tells you how to live your life? Why do you not respect why do these ideas, why do you think they don't respect the individual's own experiences with spirituality? Why do you think that it's just based off of this kind of like doctrine for living?
I sort of started that. I do respect people who are privately spiritual and don't belong to religious organizations. I have to because they're like most of my friends. So I do. But I do get I think it's kind of the norm right now, so I tend to sort of criticize what's normal. It's sort of the dominant thing. So it is in BC. It isn't in Saudi Arabia, but it is in BC. But, that's why I poked a little bit of fun at it, and sort of not to read. Eckhart Tolle, he attacks religion in his first opening paragraphs, and as just a force of evil and of authoritarianism, and that's not very fair. He's way more popular than the Protestant churches, so that's why I have a bit of fun with it. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and for me, I actually don't want to be seen as defending religion. Religion is way too complex and covers way too many things I find ugly to defend religion in general. That's why when somebody asks me, for instance, would you please, you're a religious guy, why don't you defend religion? I say, are you kidding me? In the name of religion, all kinds of butchery has happened around the world. All kinds of foolish ideas have been taught to children. All kinds of nonsense and worse. So I would far better have people who are thinking for themselves, finding their way in the world, drawing on spiritual resources as they can find them, than people who are members of any one of 100 poisonous religious groups that I could point to. So I at least don't need to say that. What I'm simply trying to suggest is that the reason why the category of spirituality works so well in this culture is that this is a culture that doesn't want to be told what to think. It doesn't really want authority figures. So we're just trying to explain, why is Vancouver so different from Dallas? That's one of the main reasons, is that people come to Vancouver to think for themselves, thank you very much, and not to have some clergyman tell them what to think. Whereas in Dallas, they seem to prefer that. That's all we're trying to do, is explain it, not to defend it.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, I'm not interested in defending or attacking religion. I'm just curious. I want to understand what it is, religion or other things that are like religion. But we've just started doing some research on this, on spiritual but not religious demographics. We don't have a lot to say, but we have some interesting findings. One of the most striking features of people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, is that these people report feeling much more connected with everything around them than religious people are, or people who say I'm not religious. So they say I feel really connected to the nature around me. They say I'm really connected to people around me. They say I'm really connected to the universe around me. But that's an interesting and fascinating way of relating with the world that is not necessarily typical of, say, Christianity. Perhaps you see more of it in Buddhism, for example. There are practices in Buddhism where you do exactly that. But this, for whatever reason, and maybe Doug knows more about this, here in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, this kind of orientation seems to be really important to people.
Yeah, it's something to do with people. So many people coming here from somewhere else, and a lot of them come here to get away from the past, and a lot of them, their past is religion and authoritarian religion. That's one factor. Some people say it's actually the geography that has always sort of kept people separate. You know, it's the resource industry, a forestry camp starts up, or a mining camp. It's there for 20 years and then it's gone. So it's hard to build community that way. So, and we're so young. And BC is a settled province, so that's a factor too.
Also, the natural world is so prominent here.
That's right. That's a big one.
I wonder. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but I wonder if that's part of what's going on here. Is that we live outdoors. There's so much natural beauty, and it's hard not to feel connected with that. And that might be
that's a big factor. People here say my church is nature. My cathedral is nature, and I relate to that too. So it's a powerful thing. You can't ignore nature.
A question over here.
Yeah, you talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering, you're saying that the numbers have kind of leveled off in terms of the charismatic Christianity sort of upswing, but that it's still holding its own more strongly than some of the others, and maybe is gaining more new followers than the others which are in decline, even if it has leveled off. I'm wondering if there are any discernible ethnic factors in that equation, the way you mentioned the Filipino community helping keep the Catholic Church strong, or any other theories you might have about the particular appeal of charismatic Christianity, whether it's ethnic groups or other sort of identifiable groups within the society.
In terms of charismatic Christianity within mainstream denominations, we saw an efflorescence of Catholic, charismatic Christians, Anglican, to some extent actually United and Presbyterian as well, back in the 60s and 70s, which was an interesting period of cultural dislocation and ferment. And those charismatic movements have diminished almost to the vanishing point since then, with very few exceptions. So what's remained in Canada are two other forms of the Pentecostal charismatic tradition. One is denominational Pentecostalism, with the biggest denomination being the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, groups that have a denominational affiliation and they're all Pentecostal all the time. And then the others would be independent churches that aren't affiliated with a Pentecostal denomination, but might be small, might be big, we generally call charismatic but non-denominational. Those churches are doing generally better, and particularly, of course, they have received an influx from Chinese and Korean immigration in particular, as well as some from South America, but mostly from East Asia, where those forms of Christianity are burgeoning. If we had more immigration from Africa, we'd see that too. It's just that very few Africans can meet the economic test to come to Canada. So some of those numbers have been higher. In the U.S., it's even more dramatic. About 50 years ago, Pentecostalism had pretty much leveled off, except for Hispanic immigration, and the continuing rise was entirely due to Latino immigration in the States. We don't have that as a factor up here. Ours is more from East Asia.
There's a Don Baker of UBC studies Korean culture, and he says there's 200 Korean churches in Metro Vancouver, which I'm going to go out with him, which is one of them, but I still can't believe that. He says they're nearly all charismatic.
Is that true?
Just one example.
Yeah.
Is that right, eh?
The reason I'm pointing at the fellow in the green shirt is that Dr. Michael Wilkinson has edited a book on Canadian Pentecostalism and actually knows more about it than the three of us combined, but he's relaxing, having his, I think, 5th beer now, so we'll just have a call on him unless we really need an expert statistic. Thank you, Michael.
I've been to some of the churches in the Fraser Valley that are charismatic, and they're pretty well, roughly speaking, 50% visible minority.
I have a question for Ara. I want to take a step back before we go forward. You write about how we have societies that climbed up the ladder, the religious ladder, and the kind of cohesion made our societies more stable and more sort of secure and trusting of each other. And now we're kicking that ladder. Can you talk a little bit about that? Who's kicking the ladder, and how did we climb it exactly?
Okay, I'll try to explain this. So this is part of the argument in the book that I just wrote, and there are lots of parts to it, but I'll give the 2-minute summary version. So basically, the idea is that throughout history, if you look at the last 10,000 years, since the agricultural revolution, when society scaled up and up and up from our hunter-gatherer existence to people living in millions of people living in these mega societies. The question then is, how did that happen? And one of the best answers I know of is religion. When you don't have any strong secular institutions that make people cooperate, the only game in town was big, powerful gods who were thought to be omniscient. They knew what you were doing. They cared about you doing something bad or good, and they intervene and punish people or reward people. So even when no one is watching, if you think that someone is watching you and this person can punish you or reward you, you're more likely to be nice to strangers. So we're naturally nice to family members, we're naturally nice to friends, but we're not naturally inclined to be nice to complete strangers. We need cultural solutions to be nice to strangers. And here we are, we're not murdering each other, even though we've never met before, or hardly ever know each other. So until very recently, religion was the only that I can think of, or one of the few, or the only solution, this kind of religion with big powerful gods, to the problem of large-scale cooperation. However, in the last few hundred years, we're seeing a remarkable social transition. In some parts of the world, it looks like, and these parts of the world that used to be very religious, like Scandinavia, have developed alternatives to religion. They have developed other mechanisms strong government, rule of law, existential security for everyone. So people don't need religion anymore. They have secular institutions. So that's what I mean when I say that basically God is replaced by government, is another way of putting it. So these societies climb the ladder of religion. They wouldn't be there if we weren't for religion, but they don't need religion anymore, so they just take it away because they found other solutions.
I think that's a really suggestive thesis, and I'm looking forward to reading this book. And I've heard the thesis before. I think it's really interesting. And one of the open questions, of course, in this broad historical view is whether, to put it in terms of another common conversation, whether Europe can keep being good without God. That whether Scandinavia can, in fact, endure the next social crisis. I was in Scandinavia this past spring and lecturing on Scandinavian culture, and it is an amazing learning while you're teaching about this place. And it is an interesting question because in many respects the cultures like Scandinavia are living off their religious past. As you say, they didn't kick the whole ladder away, they kicked the supernatural stuff away, but they kept the Christian ethics. I mean, when we talk about atheists in Canada, almost all of them are what I call Christian atheists. They're almost all atheists who nonetheless share the ethical outlook of Canada's general Christian past, as opposed to, for instance, being Maoist atheists or Stalinist atheists or Nietzschean atheists. There's actually lots of kinds of atheism, but most Canadians demonstrably aren't those kinds of atheists. So the interesting long-term historical question is, for how much longer can this civilization, which Elton Trueblood famously called a cut flower civilization, how much longer can it keep going without those kinds of religious rootage? And to me, it's an open and frightening question.
To say I agree with both these guys. Scandinavia is a very fascinating place to study. My wife is Danish, and we're so curious about these questions. And John is right that there is a foundation of Christian, it is kind of Christian atheism going on in Scandinavia. People, and this is even stranger because people pay taxes to keep the churches going, even though they don't go. Except they do go for baptisms, births, death, and weddings. And they love their churches, they're fantastically beautiful, but they do not go on Sundays, except for about 5%, which is way lower than even here. But they are building on Christian values, and that's partly why there's some resistance to immigration in Denmark and other parts of Scandinavia, because I think they're about 8% immigrants, whereas Metro Vancouver is, I'd say, 45%. They're afraid about losing their shared story, whether that guy went to mention that, because other studies have shown that when a lot of ethnic groups live side by side, that people actually do stop trusting each other because they don't identify with whatever person of a different culture. So
I was just going to say, there's this joke by the comedian Ricky Gervais said, atheism is a belief system like not skiing is a hobby. And I think that the Scandinavian atheists are like that. They're not ideological atheists. They just don't care about religion.
Yeah.
Another word for it is apatheism. They're just apathetic about religion.
Well, in fact, this picks up on the thesis you're arguing, I think, in your book further. I mean, one of the questions I think that's very open for Canadians is, can we in fact be truly multicultural? I think that we have been able to congratulate ourselves on being multicultural by being dominantly Christian and letting other people come along and open their restaurants and have their folklore once in a while. We can afford to give them their community. Generally in Vancouver, like what happens in northern Toronto with people from South Asia. Now it's interesting, because now these people aren't stepping into the traditional patterns of Christian Canada. They are expecting us to be faithful to our promise of being multicultural. And you're saying, well, then we expect not to have to be acting like Christians to be here. What is going to be the common narrative? If we don't have that big God pulling us together, I think the open question in Germany, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand is going to be this one. Over the next 20 or 30 years, can we actually have a framework of genuine multiculturalism that doesn't involve, in fact, some kind of dominance by one religious group over everybody else? I hope we can. I like to think we can, but I also think that we're working that out literally day by day. Literally, as I think of the Quebec Values Charter, day by day.
I have a question on the right here.
Hi, it was mentioned that the United States is far more religious than predictive factors would indicate. I'm wondering if sociologists have any ideas as to why this is.
they do. The American exception is actually always fascinating and also a pain in the neck to people who are trying to theorize about it. One of the interesting questions, though, or the interesting facts, is that the United States is not as religious as it seems to be. For instance, when it comes to church attendance, remember that I said that at the end of the Second World War, 2 out of 3 Canadians were going to church every week. At the end of the Second World War, the statistic in the U.S. was in the low 40s, which was the highest it had ever been in American history. One of the things that even Americans don't know is that the lowest point of church attendance in American history was at the time of the American Revolution, when everybody was supposed to be Christian, right? The lowest church attendance was at the time of the American Revolution, and church attendance in America went up every decade after that until the middle of the 20th century, when it peaked in the low 40s, where it has stayed. And even that number is really soft. Over the last 20 years, people have gone to various districts in the United States where there's supposed to be 40% church attendance, and they've actually counted to see who's in church. And the numbers are almost always over-reported by almost 100%, which makes their numbers look pretty Canadian. So one of the questions sociologists in the U.S. are asking themselves, and I trained in the U.S. and I was around these guys, is to say, are we even dealing with the right data? Are we in fact as religious as we think we are? Are politicians really gaining ground by playing the God card or even the Jesus card? Or are they in fact dealing with bad data? So that's one of the interesting questions right there. Is the United States as exceptional as it looks? I'm not sure actually the data hold. But secondly, one of the reasons that the United States is so different and why Canada looks kind of American and kind of British and why Scandinavia is so different in terms of a sociological theory is that in Scandinavia there is a powerful state church. Everybody has to be Lutheran, and then when people don't want to be that anymore, they all aren't that anymore. Like in Quebec, where you had a dominant Roman Catholic culture, in the Quiet Revolution, we're not that, and so everybody's not that. Now in English Canada, you've got a mixed economy, so to speak. You've got some dominant Protestant churches, a big Roman Catholic church, and some of these little evangelical churches on the border. So when the tide changes in the 1960s, things change variably. In the U.S., you have a much stronger culture of revivalist Christianity, which is a kind of entrepreneurial coming and going Christianity. It's much more resilient when it comes to social changes, but it also is very spiritual in the sense that it draws very little purchase on people's economic and military and political cultures. So you can actually be a good Baptist in the United States, and that will say nothing really about your view about taxation, about whether you're going to vote Republican or Democrat, whether you're going to be for the military or against the military. And so in that sense, revivalist Christianity can continue to flourish in the U.S. because it doesn't actually demand nearly as much of you as it does if it's a force for social cohesion like it was in Scandinavia or in Quebec. So that's a quick sketch of like thousands of pages of sociology, but it helps to explain why the United States, my basic thesis is, it looks more religious in some ways than it actually is.
I just want to follow up on what John said. These are, I think, very important ideas. I just want to add one more thing, which is important in explaining the American exceptionalism in religion, and that's the fact that even though the United States is a wealthy society, it's industrially advanced, it's a democracy, all these things should make them much less religious. It doesn't. And one key factor is that the United States scores very low on existential security and economic and political equality. So it's a very unequal society. Inequality levels in the United States are comparable to the third world. So people don't feel secure. There is no universal health insurance. Jobs are not as safe as in Canada or in Europe. Infant mortality is much higher than it should be, given the kind of society it is. So all these factors are predictors of religiosity.
Well, one more factor might be that Americans just are, Mark Knoll talks about this, they're just more competitive. So they're marketing the religions really hard, especially evangelicalism, because that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah,
spread the gospel, and they know how to do it, and it's been effective. There's multiple factors, I think. That's a good one.
Got a question in the middle here?
Yeah, I was wondering, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, that school of thought, they bring religion in the context of mimetics, right? And I was wondering if any of you see epistemology as also as a kind of memetics, and if so, can memes be, because memes are essentially an evolutionary unit of culture from how they define it, I think Dawkins. And so, memes and evolution share the basic fact that they can be seen on a tree of life or a tree of memes. That's my position. Would you say there was any, from a historic point of view, would you say there's a time in history where knowledge and religion diverged? And also I was wondering on the psychology side, an operational definition for religion, if you could maybe think of any, and would that fall into the no hypothesis statistical testing, because that's a big discussion in the psychology field right now.
Okay, these are complex questions you're raising. I'll start with the second question.
Just notice the no hypothesis statistical testing.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean, that's just a statistical procedure to decide if the hypothesis is supported or not supported.
No, there's in psychology we use no hypothesis statistical testing.
Right.
There was an article that just came out this year or previous showing that the no hypothesis statistical testing in psychology wasn't appropriate anymore.
Okay. So, I mean, that goes way beyond the questions that we're trying to deal with here.
And sorry, just to link the literature on priming, the concerns around priming.
There's a debate in psychology right now about how statistical testing, null hypothesis statistical testing is a widely used technique in psychology. There's a debate now that we shouldn't use it as much as we do, and we should be more careful, and there are other things we can use instead. So I'm not sure. I mean, this is a general problem in psychology that we're grappling with. In the case of religious priming studies, if you're worried about are they reliable, if that's what you're asking, they are reliable. We've done meta-analyses where we pull up many studies together.
They're reliable, but I mean, other fields like neuroscience are way more on the edge. But I guess, sure.
I think the key, probably the key word here was Dawkins.
Yeah. Okay.
And Richard Dawkins, it seems to me, once you put appropriate rhetorical filters in place and try not to be too upset by his extravagant rhetorical style, seems to me to raise interesting questions. Most of them aren't new, but that doesn't mean they're bad questions.
So the manifest, the idea of means.
But I don't think any of us are equipped to deal with that on its own basis. It's the question of cultural memes is highly controverted, to put it kindly. Frankly, most people think it's garbage. And it's
that's a good transition to another question I have for Ara about atheism and prejudice towards atheism. You wrote a paper about that. Could you maybe expand as to why atheists can be discriminated against?
Yeah, I mean, that's another big question that I've tried to deal with this question in the book. So I got interested in this question of why people distrust atheists, why many believers distrust atheists, because in many ways it's a strange prejudice. Atheists in religious societies where this prejudice is most common, atheists are not that common. They're not that visible. They're not that powerful. There is no atheist attire or cuisine or bread. It's like, it's unlike ethnic prejudice or racial prejudice or prejudice based on homophobia or sexual or gender. So we were wondering, why is there strong distrust of atheists in religious societies? And we found some interesting clues that follow up from the ideas that I was talking about earlier about religion being a social glue that brings people together based on a common supernatural jurisdiction, which is typical description of human history in many societies. So then if you follow up on that, you realize that what happens if someone so basically the idea here is that I can trust you if I think that you're under supernatural, if I think that you think that you're under supernatural surveillance. So I think that God is watching me, so I'm putting my best foot forward, I'm being nice to people, and if I think that you think the same way, then I can trust you. right? You're under some kind of constraint. Even if no one is watching you, you're not going to cheat me. You're not going to, be nasty. What happens if someone doesn't think that they're under supernatural surveillance? That's the problem, right? From the perspective of believers, atheists are wild cards. They're moral wild cards. You don't know how they're going to behave. So the key intuition behind the religious intuition behind distrust of atheists is that I can't trust them because I can't tell if they're moral. So from that we can also think of ways to remedy this distrust. So for example, we found that if we remind believers in experiments, in psychology, we tell people, hey, by the way, notice that we have strong secular institutions. We have a strong police that makes sure that people are being nice to each other. All of a sudden, believers are not as distrustful atheists. So we had an experiment where we had UBC students. Some of them watched the end of the year report of the Vancouver Police Department, where the chief of police was talking about how strong and capable the Vancouver police was. In the control condition, we had participants watch a comparable video, but it was about Vancouver as a tourist destination. And then we asked people, what do you think about atheists, among other groups? And we found that watching a video about the effectiveness of the Vancouver police reduced distrust of atheists, but it didn't reduce other kinds of prejudices. So just one example of that kind of thing.
I guess we have time for one more question.
It was mentioned briefly that there are certain religious groups that are better at keeping their children in their faith, and I was wondering why, those religious groups are more successful at doing that.
Question?
Yeah, a lot of the work in Canada has been done by, frankly, the guy who's done most of the work in Canada when it comes to sociological polling, Amy Reginald Bibby at the University of Lethbridge, and others as well. But he's done a lot of work on noting which groups are retaining their youth. And what his data don't show, though, because they're too global, is what's going on to help these students or young people stay there. Reg has got his informed guesses, but his surveys are huge. They don't actually penetrate down into the cultures involved. But those of us who studied the cultures involved have some educated guesses as well. And part of it ties in with some of what we've heard, namely that the groups that tend to retain their young people tend to give them a good reason to go to church, as opposed to going to hockey or to canoeing or to baseball or soccer on Sunday morning. Namely, God's there, and it's good for you to be with God, and your life will be better if you connect with God. There's truth there you're not going to get at school, you're not going to get in television. There's a way of life that is superior, and the groups that are unapologetic about that, the groups that actually say, we're not condemning everybody else explicitly, but we are implying that the life you have outside God is worse than the life you have connected to God. Those groups, which make greater demands but also make greater promises, that combination tends to get higher levels of adherence generally, and particularly to young people who find that there's value added, there's something there that they're not getting otherwise. Somewhat paradoxically, the religious groups that try to make church or Sunday school or youth group basically just fun tend not to keep their young people. They keep them for a while, but it really is just glorified babysitting and daycare, and the young people don't stay. I was speaking recently to the pastor of one of the largest United churches in the Vancouver area, and he has been challenging the older people in his congregation to ask their adult children who went through all of these youth programs why they don't go to church anymore. And as he probes, he finds out that what they were given was basically babysitting with a cross on top, but virtually no mention of that cross or explanation of it. There was no value added. Well, church, frankly, almost never competes very well against minor hockey or soccer or video games, and so they stopped going.
We've got time for one more. Let's go.
Hi. What was the impact of the sexual revolution, especially contraception, pornography, things like that in the 60s? It seems to me that human societies have always had this intuition that sex is an extremely powerful and dangerous thing, and the sexual revolution completely changed human history, and at least in the Western context.
probably was a factor in liberal churches that became more liberal about sexuality were the ones that started losing more members. It was, they just seemed to go together, that kind of make your own choices, be free, hardly means not showing up at church if you don't have to, because there's not that many great reasons to show up. Going back to Robert Bell a bit, like this liberal attitude, which almost was supported by the church, liberal United churches and Anglican churches, they did lead a little bit. They are leading to their own demise in some ways.
It's a curious paradox that the culture, again, everywhere else in the world, there are religions, and among every culture we can think of, there are rules about sex. I mean, there's no culture we can think of that says, do whatever you want. Like that doesn't seem to be anybody's moral intuition that sex should be whatever you want it to be. You can define it any way you like. You can enjoy it in any way you like. Like, it's only this civilization that is trying to tell us that about sex. Everybody